Areas Best Practice Call. This has been part of our series on park programs and grant programs that can assist heritage areas and your partners. And today we have a guest speaker from the National Park Service American Battlefield Protection Grants Program. Emily is going to share her presentation, and there's a few others that may be joining from the American Battlefields Program as well. I want to remind folks to keep your audio muted when you're not speaking, and that this call presentation will be recorded and shared on YouTube channel in the future. So that's also something you can share with your partners after this presentation or with other interested parties. So Emily, take it away.
Thank you, Katie. Thanks to Katie and Liz and Heather for letting us join your call today. We're really excited to speak with National Heritage Areas and hope that these grants might be something that can assist the work you're doing. I'm going to talk today about the Battlefield Preservation Planning Grant Program because that is a currently open funding opportunity. So we're in the application period right now, and it's something that nonprofits and local governments and state governments and many others are eligible to apply for. And I just also like to give a quick shout out to my colleagues, Liz Buxton and Philip Bailey, who are on this call. They also work with the American Battlefield Protection Program. So if you have questions about any of our 4 grant programs, someone I'm sure can answer it to the best of our knowledge within the program. And since we just started our 2021 funding competition, I am going to also speak a little to what you need to know to apply this year, as well as share some success stories and some grants we've recently funded that are great examples. Have you ever been inspired by a narrative of American history that you felt you were part of? The Preservation Planning Grant Program funds research and interpretive activities that help tell the full story of American history. One recent grant to the state of North Carolina will help the state incorporate the growth of recent historical scholarship on African Americans in the Civil War. They're studying how the U.S. colored troops were involved in all 20 of the state's Civil War battlefields. This research will help lead to new approaches for preservation planning, potentially new nominations for the National Register of Historic Places, and interpretation of these battlefields that recognizes the important contributions of Black soldiers and says to Black residents and visitors to North Carolina that you're part of the story of this place. Another question our grants ask and answer sometimes is how and why does this history matter? The Seneca Nation received a grant in 2016 to produce a historical study and archaeological research design for the Bucktooth Run battlefield, which was the site of a 1779 Revolutionary War engagement in the Seneca Nation's Allegheny Territory in today's New York State. Seneca oral histories recorded stories of the destruction of their towns and cornfields by American troops during this campaign, but the American military records minimized this event. So one goal of the project was to reconcile these historical narratives and try to locate the battlefield archaeologically to shed light on a period in history that was a period of loss and intergenerational trauma for the Seneca people. So this grant involved, yes?
I'm not seeing your presentation. Are others seeing it?
No.
No.
Oh.
It was up before at the big, but it's not up now. So if you want, sorry to interrupt you. But
no, thank you for letting me know. Let me try to share it again.
Okay. Yep. And
all right.
There it is.
Great. I'm glad. Sorry about that. And thanks so much, Katie. So this is a slide we were on with the Seneca Nation. And this grant funded research from various perspectives and disciplines in terms of archaeology, oral history, and historical research. And it stressed the importance of the war in Seneca history and memory and suggesting ways to interpret the contradictory sources about the battle. So through this project, the Seneca Nation showed that the meanings and the legacies of conflicts like the American Revolution are different for Native nations than many of their neighbors. And as we as a nation approach the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, these grants can sometimes help amplify these underrepresented or silent stories on how and why the Revolutionary War mattered to communities today. Battlefields are also places where people live. And so as our nation changes and those communities change, so do these landscapes. These grants can give grassroots organizations means to ask their communities, how do you want to shape this place's future? One grant to the Alliance for the Shenandoah Valley funded capacity building activities for the merger of 3 very small local conservation and community nonprofits. And they also partner with the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation, which was not part of that merger. And this grant in 2016 took a pretty expansive view of battlefield preservation as part of heritage tourism, local planning activities, and how people try to preserve rural community lifestyles that they value. So they're bringing together multiple groups with these grassroots origins in the Shenandoah Valley so they can have a larger voice in these decisions. And this grant project and their application clearly distinguished which activities would be funded as specifically tied to battlefield preservation, like creating a GIS database of protected lands, lands that are parts of battlefields, and lands to prioritize, versus other activities with other funding sources. And this grant was pretty successful for its goals of capacity building, outreach, and database building. And the organization received a new grant in 2020 for a project focused on community visioning around the future of the Port Republic and Cross Keys Civil War battlefields in their area. So this is an imaginative way to try to bring people together for places that are important to them. So those are a few examples of what these grants can do, and they're far from comprehensive. So I hope you might get some inspiration from these questions about what stories you want to tell and how you might want to shape your area's future as we give more details into the planning grant program. Armed conflict has touched pretty much every corner of American history and landscapes. And with a wealth of resources and places that NHAs are stewards of, we'd also note that battlefields can be part of important community spaces as well as environmental corridors. So documenting and preserving the state of these landscapes where battles took place can also be a part of larger strategies for environmental conservation and public access to green space for communities who might value these lands for other purposes in addition to their history. Grants can also be an important tool because they are a tool for non-federal, community-oriented control of projects and to help steer those preservation efforts. When it comes to preserving historic sites that are part of American heritage as well as landscape-level stewardship, one important principle is that the efforts can't end at the borders of protected lands. Grants are one of the tools in the National Park Service's toolbox to extend the stewardship mission by giving control of the money and the projects to other organizations for projects outside federal land and without substantial federal involvement. So now that I've given some background, I'll tell you a little about the American Battlefield Protection Program. The National Park Service's American Battlefield Protection Program, or ABPP, is a national program authorized by Congress and administered by the National Park Service for the purpose on this slide. We're a program with about 7 staff, and we're located in the Cultural Resource Partnerships and Science Directorate within the National Park Service. What that means is our offices are in Washington, D.C., and we are right down the hall from the NHA program. You can reach us easily at abpp@nps.gov, and we'll also give some individual contact information on our last slide. NPS ABPP currently administers 2 active grant programs, and 2 more were established in the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act that we anticipate will become active sometime in the fiscal year 2021. So here is a quick comparison of our grant programs. The Battlefield Land Acquisition Grants, second from the left, are our flagship grant program. Today, we're going to focus more on the preservation planning grants for a couple reasons. As I mentioned, it's currently active and limited application window of about 90 days. And also, since nonprofits and local governments are eligible to apply for them, they're probably of the greatest interest to NHAs. But we'll be happy to speak to you about any of these grant programs if you have interest in them. And please do keep a lookout for the launch of the Interpretive Modernization Grants, or also called Battlefield Interpretation Grants, which were authorized for the purpose of modernizing battlefield interpretation using technology. These grants are only applicable for battlefields that are identified in ABPP's battlefield studies, reports to Congress on Revolutionary War, War of 1812, and Civil War. They do require a 50% match. But they also will potentially play a part in some of these interpretive efforts around the Revolutionary War and other wars important in American history. So the basic idea of battlefield preservation planning grants, which are the ones we're focusing on the left on this slide, these are the annual competitive grants. I would mention also that the battlefield preservation planning grants are open to projects for sites focused on any armed conflict through all periods of American history. These grants fund documentation, research, planning, partnership building, interpretation, and outreach projects. They can focus on battlefields or associated sites associated with armed conflict from any period in American history, including ones before the United States had become independent, and including ones that don't necessarily involve the US Army. These grants are awarded every year, and they're selected for funding through a competitive merit review process. The typical awards range from about $30,000 to $100,000, but we've funded some lower and some higher than that. They don't require any matching funds. And proposals should propose projects that are reasonable to complete in about 2 years. We have awarded a few preservation planning grants in the past that are related to national heritage areas. They've supported efforts to designate a new heritage area, to develop a management plan for a recently designated area, and to develop educational materials for school groups visiting sites within an NHA. NHAs themselves can apply for and receive these grants. So can organizations within your boundaries. They can support projects from very small site-based individual projects to more regional strategies and collaborations. And partnerships and engagement, both between organizations and within a community and between governments, are highly weighted within our merit review criteria. So we hope that you'll consider this funding opportunity, share it with your members and stakeholders, and we can also offer to schedule more individualized calls to present or speak to audiences within a single NHA. Eligible applicants have to be organizations, not individuals, but within that, state and local governments can apply, public and private institutes of higher education, private nonprofit organizations, and Native American governments, which includes federally recognized tribes and other tribal organizations and Native Hawaiian organizations. Here are a couple of important definitions that you will see with even more detail in our funding announcement, which is a large document available on grants.gov, which gives you all of the information about this funding competition, what's eligible, what an application includes, and what the selection process involves. So I will share a link in the chat to the grants.gov link for that document and all the application materials. But for now, I'd like to mention that eligible activities have to focus on planning, interpreting, and preserving sites associated with armed conflicts. And we define an armed conflict following both the language in our founding legislation and a pretty wide body of scholarship across multiple fields. This is a widely used term that's recognized more broadly than the term battlefield in some ways. An armed conflict is a period of collective violence characterized by specific events and bounded in time. So for example, an armed conflict could be the American Revolution or what's known as the Pequot War, but it would not be a broad thematic category like struggles for independence or violence against indigenous people. An armed conflict could also be a single episode as well. And these projects have to not only be associated with an armed conflict in American history, they also have to be place-based in some way. They have to contribute to the preservation of battlefields or associated sites that are tied to events that occurred during an armed conflict. So this is what distinguishes a preservation planning grant from any kind of very general historical study, is the connection to place. And I mentioned both battlefields and associated sites as possible historic sites with connections. There are themes that are defined for associated sites. It's how they're tied with the events of an armed conflict through the military, through government, law, politics, and diplomacy, intellectual history, economics of war, society, or transportation. And we haven't given a clear definition of associated sites for this grant program previously, so we don't have a lot of funded examples. But a few examples of potentially eligible sites could include a fort, a supply depot, all kinds of infrastructure that's really tied into preparation for conflict, as well as rail lines that provided supply and transport. Thinking about the Civil War, for example, contraband camps, recruitment stations, and hospitals. These are just a few examples of the kinds of sites that could be an associated site in a proposal. And we're open to proposals that are applying this definition in new and historically grounded ways for our program. And then here's a list of eligible activities that gives a few big umbrellas of what kinds of activities the grant funds without being entirely exhaustive. What I'd like to emphasize here is that we construe preservation activities quite broadly, not just to include activities that help maintain and document the physical condition of a site, but activities that help to foster stewardship and engagement with historic places, with their local communities, stakeholders, and long-term people who can be involved and appreciate these places. So preservation activities can also include educational activities, community meetings, and any number of creative possibilities. There are some limits to eligibility, though. For example, the types of activities that are not legal under federal regulations at all, such as lobbying and fundraising using grant money. We don't fund projects that are not related to battlefields, associated sites, or place-based stewardship. We don't fund projects that involve land acquisition. That would be our battlefield land acquisition program instead. And currently, none of our active grant programs fund capital projects or bricks and mortar preservation work. We also don't fund activities that we think would harm a battlefield's integrity rather than helping to preserve it, like large-scale archaeological data recovery as one example. So this is a very broad grant program that can fund a huge range of activities with a few guardrails and limits. I'd also like to make a quick note here about working with federal agencies. Projects on federal land or using federal resources can be funded if they meet what's called the public purpose requirement. That means that grants can't fund activities that are of direct benefit to the federal government or help an agency fulfill its legislated mission. Another note is that unlike a cooperative agreement, which you may be familiar with, a grant-funded project should not be directed or approved by a federal agency. It has to be driven by the non-federal recipient, and I'll provide an example of that. And finally, if you have questions about how federal funding for grants differs from other sources of federal funding or the NHA program rules, Katie and Liz are extremely knowledgeable. They're the first people I would recommend going to with questions. And we at the American Battlefield Protection Program are also happy to answer any questions about eligibility for our grants. Now I'd like to go from this general to a couple of examples of how we apply these eligibility criteria to make things clear. One example is a recent grant to the Pechanga Band of Indians in California to document the site of the Temecula Massacre and associated cemetery. This was a pretty important project to them. It's a sensitive site where a lot of ancestors are buried and not all of it is on tribal land. And so identifying and documenting these sites is a really important step in preservation for them. But they also worked on commemoration of what that meant for their history through documentary filmmaking. And we consider both of these, the site survey, the inventory, the research and oral history, and the documentary film, all of those are eligible activities under preservation. There are also two ways to understand eligibility in relation to armed conflict. When they applied, the guidance at that time said a site has to be connected to a specific battle. And so they said the Temecula Massacre was a result of the Battle of San Pascual, which was a specific battle within the Mexican-American War. But we received a lot of questions about some ambiguities around this, like would the site of a massacre count on its own because it wasn't a two-sided battle? Or what about funding projects related to forts where a battle didn't take place there? And so that's why we went back and developed this expanded guidance about armed conflict, saying that this is eligible as a site where important events happened during the Mexican-American War. Another example is a grant that was completed by the City of Monroe, Michigan for collaborative preservation and management planning for the River Raisin battlefield. This grant was based on preserving a large landscape connected to both the specific Battle of River Raisin and the War of 1812 as a larger armed conflict. And they brought together local and national government units to compile information on the history of the battlefield, extant resources and landscapes, identify protected and non-protected lands and how they're zoned, and make recommendations for how to manage different units of the battlefield better for future preservation and current use and interpretation. And I'm highlighting this grant and showing its eligible activities as well. I'd like to mention it as an example of an eligible grant that involved partnership with a federal agency and met that public purpose standard. And that's because it was led and managed by the community partner, even though part of the River Raisin battlefield is managed by the National Park Service. The local government drove this planning process and coordinated with other governments as well, even though they did also work with the National Park Service as one of their stakeholders and members of this preservation collective. And this is important because there are a lot of National Park Service battlefield parks around the country that only preserve part of larger battlefields. So this is a kind of model for a community taking the lead and maintaining an appropriately limited federal role in a grant-funded project. So with those examples, I'll tell you a little now about the application process. Our application period is currently open. I typed the link to the application materials on grants.gov into the chat, and I'll do that again at the end of the meeting. But applications are due on February 12th, 2021. After receiving them, ABPP staff will review them for eligibility and completeness, and we'll initiate our Section 106 review, which is review for potential impacts on historic properties. And then after that, for grants that are found eligible, we will bring them to a merit review panel for competitive merit review. And this is a panel of subject matter experts in the areas our grants tend to cover. And they will provide independent ratings of each grant that will help us figure out how many can be funded by the amount of money we have. We'll conduct a risk assessment for how well able it seems that applicants can manage federal funds. And if necessary, we will negotiate specific budget and scope items based on individual projects. And then we anticipate awarding the grants in May 2021. You can apply by searching on grants.gov. All of the materials are available on grants.gov. Our website will send you to grants.gov. And you can search by this CFDA number, 15.926, or by the name Battlefield Preservation Planning Grants, and it'll be the first result. Again, also going to share that link in the chat. You can download the application package from there. That includes the Notice of Funding Opportunity, which is that document that is pretty comprehensive in telling you everything you need to know, as well as a set of standard application forms, many of which you're probably familiar with from the NHA program. And then you'll complete and submit an application through the grants.gov workspace. The application consists of several standard forms from grants.gov. The project-specific documents include a project narrative, which tells us what you're going to do and addresses the specific questions that reviewers will be looking at in a merit review panel. A budget narrative that goes through why and how you would spend the money that you're applying for. A map of the site or sites the project focuses on. A federally negotiated indirect cost rate agreement if you have one. And then other supporting documents that may vary from proposal to proposal, such as, for example, resumes, CVs, letters of support. And letters of support can come from any potential partners or stakeholders who you may be working with. a couple that can help strengthen application are letters of support from any federally recognized tribes who have a stake in the history of the armed conflict itself or the land that your project is on, and state historic preservation offices who can also be great resources in a lot of ways. Excuse me. Once a proposal is found eligible, we will have the merit review panel look at it and score it according to these criteria. And unfortunately, going into the description for each of these is just too much to present on a PowerPoint. And so I'm again going to refer you to that notice of funding opportunity document on grants.gov, which will describe each one of these in detail. But really, we're looking to understand what the project is, why it's important, what the outcomes are that you're looking for, and how you'll achieve those. The readiness of the applicant to manage the federal grant and the project itself successfully. What kind of partnerships and community and stakeholder engagement are going to make this relevant and sustainable in the long term. Secretary of the Interior priorities is also, it's priorities set by this administration, in this case in particular, closely tied to partnerships and engagement. And then finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about the FY 2021 funding areas or focus areas, because those are areas that we're considering important funding priorities for our program this year. One of those is grants that focus on sites that are not well represented in our program so far, which I'll talk about on the next slide. Another is projects that help us understand the experiences of people who lived through armed conflicts associated with American independence. I may need to get a drink of water. But we see these armed conflicts associated with independence as not limited to the American Revolution, but including events that helped shape the early United States before and after that. Examples including, for example, the Pueblo Revolt, Nat Turner's Rebellion, and probably much more. We have a few goals with the outreach we're doing this year that tie into our focus areas on sites that are underrepresented in our funding portfolio so far. We'd really like a broader pool of new applicants, and we'd like, especially for our expanded guidance on eligible armed conflicts and associated sites, to help new potential applicants realize that they may be eligible for these grants, or projects that they have could use these grants for assistance when they might not have realized that before. We'd like to fund projects and organizations who are committed to telling the full American story from a diversity of perspective. And some of these include those program areas that we would like to be seeing more successful applications and projects in. Those include Black history, Indigenous-led projects focusing on Indigenous stories, projects for looking at associated sites, and projects focusing on sites west of the Mississippi, where we funded some in these areas, but see that the bulk of our grants have gone to sites that are on the east side of the Mississippi. So in review, this year's funding competition has just started. We're excited to share application materials and to fund new projects that are really directed by communities and their needs and representing the histories of all Americans. We are offering a series of webinars this fall with a lot of the same basic information about how to apply, but some with a more thematic focus on Native American and African American histories and how they relate to battlefield preservation. Those are available on our website, and we would invite you or organizations in your NHAs to sign up for those if you're interested in knowing more. We'd also be happy to schedule individualized calls for NHAs and other organizations you work with, because we know there are a lot of stories to be told and a lot of important places to be cared for in your areas, and we'd really love to hear some of your ideas. So now I will open it up to the Q&A. We are open to just any general questions you might have, and if you'd like to offer us feedback on potential barriers to applying for a federal grant and how we might be able to make this opportunity even more accessible. We'd love to hear that as well. Thank you.
Any questions? I guess one thing while people are thinking about their questions, we have had the opportunity myself to sit in on the review panel and score kind of the breakdown of scores. And many heritage areas are often a partner in a project. They might not be the applicant themselves, but a letter of support from an executive director of a heritage area or someone on staff saying how this is valuable to the heritage area, as well as even mentioning if there's a site that's a priority in your management plan or how this fits in. Erie Canalway often wrote letters of support, even potentially for the Seneca Nation project that was shared, that aren't necessarily a priority project of the heritage area, but it talks about the organization and the credibility of that organization and where it is within the corridor. And maybe oftentimes it can be another historic site that has a canal story, but also has this, as land use changes over time, a multiple layered history where they can talk about that. And I think that kind of partnership approach and demonstrating that connection is valuable. So kind of in the same way as a superintendent might write a letter of support saying they're aware of the group, kind of gives also credibility sometimes if they're a first time applicant. Liz, did you want to share anything?
Sorry, what, Katie?
Did you, from your work with the Battlefield program, did you want to share anything?
No, not necessarily. I just think it might be helpful, Emily, if you could describe maybe how your program would view an NHA partnering with another organization to kind of apply together and how that may work. Because there's another example of an NHA had applied for an African American Civil Rights Network grant, and they kind of acted like a pass-through to the organization, or maybe like the fiscal agent. And I just thought maybe if you could describe how your program may see that as a potential or maybe not.
Interesting question. I think so far for this grant program, the partnerships that we've seen have been essentially where only one of the partners is being funded by the grant. So maybe the other organization would apply and the NHA would work with them but not be funded by the grant, or the NHA would apply, but then the other organization. That's how we've seen it so far. I can check into the question a little bit more. I think that it is possible for another organization to act as a pass-through, but it would be a little bit different than we've seen so far.
Yeah, I just think the example I'm thinking of actually it was a bricks and mortar project. And so I think it related to the property owner maybe not having the capacity to manage a federal grant. And so the NHA stepped in and acted as the applicant and passed through in order to kind of help them in that sense.
Okay. I was going to ask if Christina Rado is on the call. She's a manager of American Battlefield Protection Program. And if so, if she might want to address that question.
Hi, I'm on the phone, sorry, but I didn't hear the question because I was on the other phone. So is it, is the answer is the question, can a heritage area apply in collaboration or in partnership with another organization, a subsidiary?
Basically, yeah.
But specifically as a path through.
I wouldn't say categorically we'd rule it out. We just see the relationship and whether or not it made sense, because it does make sense, especially if an organization doesn't feel they have the capacity to manage a grant, to partner with an NHA who would help to manage that grant. So if there's something that a specific NHA has in mind, I would encourage you to talk to us directly, and we can tell you if there would probably be anything that would rule it out. But I don't see anything in the notice of funding opportunity or financial assistance regulations that would prohibit that.
So Mackenzie from Ohio, from Dayton, Ohio, said that the trainings are behind the DOI firewall, the registration for future webinars for the Battlefield Protection Program. Are there other links that or can we give them the link and then it won't put them behind the firewall? I guess maybe we could even test that out. Do you guys know how partners join your calls?
So is it the link from our website that people are having trouble with?
Mackenzie, you want to address that?
Hi, everyone. Thank you. I used the link that Emily posted in the chat a few minutes ago to take me to the NPS website for the grant opportunity. On that website, let me click through it again. There is the opportunity to sign up for the December 9th webinar. When I click on the register here button, it takes me to that DOI talent sign-in, which we don't have access to as non-federal employees.
Okay, we will get a public link for that.
Thank you.
Hey, can I address that for a second? So it is a DOI talent page that basically we can go in and set up the webinar. But my understanding is you would just have to have the meeting number in order to eventually join it.
Maybe we can
It's a
troubleshoot.
registration page where you put in your name and email that should be showing up.
Oh, I see. Yeah, that's not showing. Yeah.
So it takes me directly to the WebEx. I click the register here button and it takes me directly to, I guess, where I'd put that meeting code in.
You're clicking on the December 9th one?
Yes. Just an FYI. I mean, I'd love to share the opportunity of your program. We have a large Veterans Administration facility here. That was maybe going to be my second question, is how do you view veterans, like soldier home assets? Are those considered associated sites? So there's two problems. One, I can't get the link to share with our nonprofit partner who does preservation work at our soldiers' home. And then the second question is more of a larger question of how does this program view Veterans Administration sites, like soldier homes?
So first, I think I need to fix the link in terms of the registration. That is not taking you to where it should be taking you, and I will fix that right after this call. Second question, I think I might have missed a little bit of the first question, so I'll answer the second part, but how would we view VA homes is basically to be considered an associated site eligible for these grants, they would have to meet the eligibility criteria around being associated with an armed conflict on American soil. That is part of our founding legislation, so that the conflict itself has to connect to American soil. And perhaps the people there are some direct connection to that. And then in terms of being an associated site, it would be the clear association with the conflict. Does that make sense? So it would have to be a kind of a case-by-case basis based on the details of the project and the history.
For sure. Thank you very much.
Any other questions? as we said, anyone can reach out to Emily or the entire team and ask direct questions that may be more pinpointed to your area, or we will be sharing this webinar, and if you want to share it with your partners, that's a good way to get them engaged, and if they have follow-up questions afterwards as well. Don't be shy. We have about 25 people on the call. So if there aren't any questions, I'll thank Emily very much for the presentation, and Christine and Liz for helping answer questions. We know that heritage areas have been the recipient of these grants in the past, and with this new kind of interpretation and broadening view of telling more American stories, we really want to engage heritage areas and their partners in these opportunities. For several years, like the War of 1812 kind of commemoration year and the Civil War 250th, there were a ton of applicants, and there haven't been as many applicants of late, so that's good to know in terms of competition. With the Revolutionary War time period anniversary coming up, I would expect there be an uptick in that area. But there's opportunities here and substantial funding available. So we hope you guys take advantage of those opportunities. Heather, did you want to talk about the December call?
Yes. So for the December call, we're doing something a little bit different. It's going to be a little bit earlier in December. It's going to be December 10th, Thursday, December 10th at the same time, 2 p.m. Eastern Standard, but it's going to be a little bit longer. We're increasing it to 90 minutes. And the reason we're doing that is there have been a lot of new heritage areas and new staff. And so we're going to talk about the National Heritage Area and a report that we all complete to submit to the WASO office. And so Liz is actually going to come on and share a little bit about the reporting process and some, tips on how to do it. And then we're going to hear from hopefully a couple heritage areas to talk about how they complete different sections of it and kind of do our normal best practices thing. And by expanding it to 90 minutes, we're leaving lots of time for people to ask questions. So what I'm asking for is if you would like to share something, or if you have a specific question that you would like answered during this training workshop, please email it to me. My email is on most of the best practice call emails, and I'll send it out an email probably after Thanksgiving with all the information. So if you would like to do something like you have a question you want answered, or you would like to share about, oh, we do this, I think we do this section really well, reach out to me and let me know. And I think Sarah wants to talk about January.
Yes. Hey, y'all. So for January's call, we're going to do kind of like what we did early on when we started implementing Zoom, just kind of sharing what you guys are doing in response to the pandemic. So our organization, we are having to take a hard look at some of our programming, things that we typically do, and kind of pivoting. And so this call is going to be about like, what is 2021 going to look like for your National Heritage Area? How are you changing and adapting what you're doing, and also how you're changing and adapting what you're doing with your partners. Like one of our partners basically pulled out of an annual event that we have every year. So we're trying to figure out how we figure that out. So that's what that call is going to be about. If you've got something specific that you want to share and have an opportunity to do that, you can email me and I'll put my email address in the chat. But that is kind of what the January call is going to be about, just kind of sharing how we move forward in 2021.
Thank you. I put Sarah's email at Arabia Mountain and Heather's at Looking for Lincoln as the point of contacts for those calls. We found that the spring calls, when everyone was pivoting, were very helpful to those planning. So kind of like new year, new plans, how you're changing things. Or we want to hear from those that aren't changing things, like those that still ran a marathon or something like that, and how it went. How did it work? How did you change that up? Those that made runs more of a virtual kind of experience or added in biking or other opportunities. because we know folks had a real high uptick in trail use and other uses. So kind of to hear from a broad spectrum of what's happening, how you're pivoting, if you usually use a lot of volunteer hours that maybe you're using volunteers differently, how you're making your match or your in-kind when things changed quickly and unexpectedly. So we really hope folks take advantage of this kind of platform and an opportunity to share together. Any other questions, comments, anyone want to share? Quiet today. Well, if that's it, then everyone have a lovely Thanksgiving. Stay healthy, stay safe, and keep up the good work. Thank you all, and thank you, Emily, for the presentation.